So I'm David Germano here from the University of Virginia, and I'm here to introduce today's speaker on behalf of our co-sponsors, the Center for South Asian Studies, or the South Asia Center, Tibet Center, and the Contemplative Sciences Center. And if you're interested in other talks that those sponsor, just Google Contemplative Sciences, Tibet Center, South Asia Center, UVA, and you'll find the mailing list. And most of our events have more advance notice, but this was an opportunity we had since Leigh Brasington was in town, and so we took advantage of that opportunity to offer today's talk. So the talk today is entitled Jhanas, Buddhist Meditative Absorptions in Modern Times. And I first knew Leigh, I guess we were just speculating, maybe about 14, 15 years ago. And we met in a completely different context, which had to do with Tibetan-oriented software developments. And I had no idea at all that he had the slightest thing to do with this subject. And about just a couple years ago, I suppose, I stumbled upon his name on some websites and so forth and started reading, and I thought, I know someone by that name. And it turned out it was actually him. So this is the first time first time we've ever met.
Right.
We had a very robust correspondence, like I do with many people, that had nothing to do with face-to-face encounters. So it was a great opportunity for me also to renew our friendship and actually do it in flesh and blood. So I want to give a little bit of a history of Leigh's involvement in Buddhist studies and technology and so forth, and then just offer some short reflections on the value of today's talk for us here at the University of Virginia. Leigh is a son of the South, grew up in Mississippi, and was educated in Tennessee, so he's coming back to his roots. But for 35 years, he was a product of the West. He was living in the Bay Area, doing software engineering, not of the Tibetan variety. That was a kind of side hobby, but basically in kind of nuts and bolts of software engineering for various kinds of firms. And in 1985, he first encountered Buddhist meditation in the form of Ayya Khema, a German Jewish Theravada nun, who taught the traditions that he's going to be talking about today, the Jhanas, who later died in 1997. And after that, he has traveled a lot around the world in different places. He's lived a bit in Thailand, where he studied with Ajahn Buddha Dasi. And he's also studied since 1992 with some various Tibetan teachers, but particularly Tsoknyi Rinpoche, a very well-known Tibetan teacher. And his own personal traditions and practices kind of merges this practice from early Buddhist traditions by way of Theravada on the Jhanas, which we'll be talking about today, and also Tibetan Buddhist practices. And for the last 6 years, I learned today, he's been a nomad, not a Tibetan nomad. He has no tent, no yaks, nothing like that. But he basically has stitched together the last 6 years of just going from place to place to place, doing retreats, teaching retreats, staying with friends, doing meditative practice. And so he is a modern form of nomadism. And he's currently working on his first book entitled Right Concentration, a Practical Guide to the Jhanas, which will be published by Shambhala in the fall of 2015. And so I'm not going to waste much more of your time with my own thoughts, but what excited me about this was I have spent the last couple of years rereading a lot of things to do with Buddhist meditation. And I think when we look at the relationship of contemporary forms of practice with historical forms of practice, there's a lot of ways we can go wrong. And one way we can go wrong is I think of it as a California weekend where you can just glance at anything and 5 hours later you're a master and you can teach in LA for 3 days. And that's beautiful. I mean, in its own way, it might be a quite beautiful thing, but I'm not sure how much value there is to it. And there's probably even a bit of arrogance at appropriating another people's tradition and culture, then after a couple of hours throwing it out there as a product, a commercialized product. On the other hand, sometimes people can get very arrogant about talking about the way we can understand these scriptures of the past, whether they're Buddhist or Hindu or Islamic or Catholic and so forth, and think about practices in the present. And especially scholars, I hate to say, but like at the University of Virginia or other institutions of higher education, we think, oh, you couldn't possibly do that. You haven't read all of this and that, and how can we ever know what they were actually practicing and so forth. But the reality is with Buddhism for the last 2,500 years, that was Buddhism. It was people looking at text, and there were fragmentary oral traditions and practices, and people were also just looking at text, old text people were neglected and so forth, and they were coming up with their own interpretations. Or they were looking around them and seeing, that's what people say we're doing the practices. I look at this text, sorry, it doesn't correspond. So I'm going to go back to that text and reimagine and rethink how we might pursue these practices about concentration or performance visualization or compassion cultivation and so forth. And so in that way, when we see someone like Leigh who spent a good chunk of his life and time and energy looking at early Buddhist scriptures and thinking about them and practicing them and teaching them and so forth, it's really part of a long, continuous 2,500-year history of this across different cultures and different people. And the outrage, it was always constant. The outrage was there 2,500 years ago. It was there in Tibet. It was there in China, etc. And so we find our own way between the voices of innovation and conservation, between scholarly perspectives and experiential perspectives, between outrage and acceptance or whatever other poles we might find ourselves within. So Leigh has really cultivated a highly experiential way of talking about the early Buddhist scriptures and relating them to practical forms of concentration. And so I thought it was really exciting to get the chance to have him come here and share his experience and perspective with us. And also a very great pleasure for me to finally meet him in the flesh. So please join me in welcoming Leigh.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a really great pleasure to be here. I've been teaching now for, since 97, so what's that, 17 years? And it's the first chance I've had to teach at a university. And for it to be this university with all the history, and this university with all the Buddhism and contemplative stuff going on, yeah, it's very nice to be here. And to do it in the South, I mean, it's great. So, the Jhanas. When I was thinking about this talk, I said, I should ask how many people know anything about the Jhanas. But if I were to ask you if you know anything about the Jhanas, I mean, what you know could be huge. On my website, I have a page where I list 38 different states of consciousness that go by the name jhana. Okay, so if you raise your hand, which of those 38 states are you talking about? So what I'm most interested in is what's found in the early suttas, right? The closest we have to the teachings of the Buddha. When I first started meditating, my question was, what was he doing under that tree that night? I want to do that, because it seemed to have made quite a big difference. So what was he doing under that tree that night? Well, he was meditating, right? Okay. The Pali word for the verb to meditate is actually based on the word jhana. Okay, so I suspect he was practicing jhana under the tree that night. In fact, there's a sutta in the Middle Length Discourses, number 36, where that's what he says he's doing under that tree that night. So the word jhana is Pali, dhyana is Sanskrit, chan is Chinese, and Zen is Japanese. So, and it just means to meditate in most of these other traditions. But for the Buddha, the jhanas, plural, were 4 altered states of consciousness that were brought on by concentration and yielded even more concentration. They were a method of stair-stepping your way down to deeper and deeper levels of concentration. And so when he would give a discourse to his monks and he would say, monks, there are roots of trees, there are empty huts, go meditate. He basically would say, go practice jhana. This was meditation as far as we can tell at the time of the Buddha, at least for a large part of what was thought of as meditation. So, what are these states and how should they be used? The states are, as I said, altered states of consciousness, and they're generated by, they're accessed by generating sufficient concentration to give you access. In the later literature, this is called access concentration. And there are a number of ways to generate sufficient concentration to give you access to these jhanas. In the suttas, there's some 40 different meditation methods talked about that aren't the jhanas. And about 30 of those can be used to generate what I'm calling access concentration. Enough concentration so that you can enter the jhanas. Probably the one that you would be the most familiar with would be mindfulness of breathing. This seems to be a very, very ancient form of meditation. It's found in the Upanishads. I've heard estimates that mindfulness of breathing was invented or discovered or whatever anywhere from 500 to 2,500 years before the Buddha. We really don't know. It was a long time ago. It was a very well-established practice at the time of the Buddha. So what I'm going to talk about is how to generate access concentration using mindfulness of breathing, and then I'll talk briefly about other methods that can be used as well. So in the suttas, it says that one resorts to the root of a tree, the forest, a hillside cave, a charnel ground, a heap of straw, a secluded dwelling. Secluded dwelling, I think, is probably going to work best in the West. All right? One sits down cross-legged, holds one's body erect, and sets up mindfulness at the mouth. All right, so sits down cross-legged. That's hard for us to do in the West because we have these evil things called chairs that have screwed up our ability to sit cross-legged. But sit in a comfortable upright posture, one that is comfortable enough so that you can maintain it for the length of the meditation period. And upright because, well, that supports the breathing and helps keep you awake. And then one sets up mindfulness at the mouth. I think mouth is used here like the mouth of a cave, meaning opening. It doesn't literally mean the mouth, and probably means the opening of the nostrils. All we know is it says mouth, and yeah, scholars got all sorts of interpretations. So if you've ever practiced mindfulness of breathing, what you find is you sit down, you put your attention on the tactile sensations of breathing, and very soon your mind wanders off. I mean, it's not if your mind wanders off, it's when your mind wanders off. Well, the thing to do is realize that we are descended from beings that were busy checking out their environment. They didn't really hyper-focus in on anything. If they did, well, they didn't see the saber-toothed tiger, they got eaten, they didn't reproduce. All right, so we don't have the ability to concentrate in a one-pointed way naturally. It wasn't a particularly useful thing out on the savannah in Africa. So you get distracted. It's no big deal. What's useful, label your distraction. That helps you disidentify with it and also can give you insight into where your mind habitually goes. Does it go to the past? Does it go to the future? Notice how seldom you get distracted into the present. Isn't that odd, since that's all there is? Okay. So you notice you're distracted, you label your distraction, relax, come back to the breathing. This is the strategy for generating access concentration. I won't say it's not possible to force your mind to stay with the breathing. Yes, it can be done, but it's not useful. It produces such a tight mind that you're not going to be able to access the jhanas. The phrase that I like to use is relaxed diligence. Okay, so you notice you're distracted, no big deal. Label the distraction, relax, come back to the breathing. If you can do that with the intention to really, you want to stay with the breathing, you want to catch the distractions, eventually your mind settles into access concentration, which we could define as being fully with the object of meditation. And if there are thoughts, they're wispy and in the background and don't pull you off into distraction. So you're knowing each in-breath, you're knowing each out-breath. The thoughts are more like, oh, this is good. Is that what he meant by access? Rather than when I get to Bermuda, I'm going to, all right? So you've arrived. It helps to stay at this state of access concentration. Well, I tell the students 5 to 10 to 15 minutes. Because by the time you get there, your sense of time, it's not working like it usually does. So stay there for an extended period of time. There can be other signs that you're at access concentration. One of the signs is that if you're meditating with your eyes closed, your visual field seems to get a diffuse white light. It's almost like you're meditating on a cloudy day and the sun comes out and got a little brighter. Or you're meditating in a dark room and somebody started inching up the dimmer switch and it got brighter behind your eyes. You open your eyes, none of that happened. Apparently when our minds get quiet, our brains tend not to get quiet, but to tend to go into a quieter state, but there's still random firings throughout the brain. So what was really deliberate has now become more or less random, including in your visual cortex. You do realize you've never seen anything but your visual cortex, right? You look up here and you see the blackboard. You assume there's a blackboard there, but all that you're seeing is what's going on with the neurological activity in your visual cortex. Well, when you get quiet, the inhibiting of the firing of the neurons in your visual cortex stops happening, and you just get random firings. I think you're probably aware that if you mix a lot of colors together, it turns white, and that's where the visual field comes from. And so there you are with a quiet mind, and you can see how quiet it is because you've got the diffuse white light. If you're using mindfulness of breathing as your object, your breath may become quite shallow. Not surprising because you're not thinking, you're not doing anything physically, and so you don't need a lot of oxygen. Now, some people panic when this happens and they take a deep breath, which is actually the wrong thing to do. We don't know for sure, but it would seem that the onset of the first jhana is accompanied by either a decrease in oxygen concentration in the bloodstream or an increase in carbon dioxide, and probably both, okay? But this seems to be from all the anecdotal evidence what's going on. So if your breath gets very shallow, a good sign that you're concentrated. But remember, the key thing is you're not getting distracted. Having been at access concentration for the 5 to 10 to 15 minutes, or if your breath is so subtle you can't follow it, then there's a trick. You shift your attention to a pleasant sensation. Now you might be thinking, what pleasant sensation? All right. You've all seen Buddha statues, and you might have noticed they all have that little smile on their face. That's not just for artistic purposes. That's a teaching aid. You're supposed to smile when you meditate. If you put a fake smile on your face when you start meditating, by the time you get to access concentration, it will have a sense of genuineness. And so you can shift your attention 1 inch from the nostrils to the smile, and then just focus on enjoying the pleasantness of that smile. Now, the smile, when it works really well, but it seems to only work for about 25% of the students I work with. The most common place people find a pleasant sensation is in the hands, a sort of warm, tingly glow. Okay, stop paying attention to the breath, pay attention to the pleasantness of that warm, tingly glow in your hands. Other possibilities, the heart center, third eye, top of the head, top of the shoulders, you name a body part. I've had some student that found a pleasant sensation there when they got to access and were able to focus on it and ride that pleasant sensation into the first jhana. So after you've established your attention on the pleasant sensation, you quickly realize how important it is that you have good access concentration. A pleasant sensation is just sitting there doing nothing is, well, hard to stay with. It's really subtle. The breath comes in, the breath goes out. That's real exciting compared to this mildly pleasant sensation doing nothing. But if you can maintain your attention on the pleasant sensation, eventually it will increase. Just a little, and then a little more, and then a little more, and then eventually it just erupts into what's called in the Pali Canon, piti and sukha. Piti could be translated as glee. I see it translated most often as rapture. I've seen euphoria, ecstasy, delight, interest. It's a physical release of pleasant energy. And it's accompanied by sukha, which is joy or happiness, an emotional experience. So what you've just done, you sat down in your secluded place in a comfortable posture. You started tracking your breathing, coming back from your distractions, until your mind really settled down and got quiet, access concentration, no distractions happening. And then you shifted your attention to something pleasant. And if you do nothing else, the jhana will come and find you. People talk about doing the jhanas. You can't actually do the jhanas. What you can do is set up supportive conditions, and then the jhana comes and finds you. What you're doing is setting up a positive feedback loop. You know, positive feedback loop? Like, if this were a microphone and I were to hold it up to the speaker, then it would make that awful noise, right? Okay? That's a positive feedback loop of noise. The ambient noise in the room comes into the mic, gets amplified, comes out louder, goes back into the mic, louder still, amplified more. All right, you got the picture. You're doing the same thing with your mind, only it's not noise, it's pleasure. You're quiet enough that you can turn your mind to something pleasant and stay focused undistractedly on the pleasantness of that pleasant experience. And that's pleasant that you're focused on that. That adds a little more pleasantness to your mind. Adding a little more pleasantness, that's even more pleasant. And adding, okay, you get the picture, right? Just like the positive feedback loop of the noise from the mic too close to the speaker, you're getting the same thing to happen with pleasure until it literally erupts into this state of piti and sukha. When it comes on, it can be quite startling. It feels like you're going out of control. I have students who, it started to happen and they freaked out and backed off because they felt like they were going out of control. What I tell them, though, is, it's nothing to worry about. I mean, you've only never been in control. It's only the illusion of control you're giving up, so let it go. And I also point out if it was dangerous, I'd probably be dead by now, right? So it's really just tricking your mind into making you, ecstatically happy in the most extreme circumstances. Some people get it kind of mild. Some people get it, finger in the light socket, strong. Depending on how strong the intensity of the piti is, the physical component, basically if you want to stay there, inversely proportional to the strength of the piti. So if it's mild, you could stay there 5 or 10 minutes. If it's quite strong, you might want to bail out after 30 seconds. Okay? So you've put yourself into this state where you've gotten piti to arise, and hopefully it's brought with it sukha, and now you're not focused on the breathing or the pleasant sensation, you're focused on the piti sukha experience. What's going on neurologically? Well, I wish I knew. I have meditated for science a number of times at the med school at University of Washington in Seattle and at Yale in Connecticut. And we have pictures of my brain on jhanas. And we can definitely see that things are changing. One of the things that was very noticeable, not so much in the first jhana, because the first jhana is very difficult to track because of the muscle tension that arises with the piti. It messes up EEG. If you move your head in an fMRI, it messes up the fMRI. But in the second, which is very similar to the first, just not as intense, they've noticed that the nucleus accumbens, which is a reward center in the sort of the center of your brain, is very, very active. Okay, the neuroscience has said to me, when you're in the second jhana, your nucleus accumbens is on overdrive. The nucleus accumbens is, as I said, the reward center. And so if you're a student and your professor gives you an A and you feel really good, that's because of the activity of your nucleus accumbens. I guess if you're a professor and some student writes a paper and it's exceptionally good and you're like, well, I taught this guy something, you feel rewarded. Yeah, same thing, right? So we're seeming to hyperstimulate the reward system automatically with just nothing more than our mental lack of activity, really. Lack of activity and directing of attention. The nucleus accumbens generates dopamine. Dopamine breaks down into norepinephrine. if you know anything about norepinephrine and its side effects, they're seemingly very similar to PT. Norepinephrine is involved in muscle tension and so forth. In the first jhana, your muscles get tense, they might twitch. Norepinephrine can produce heat. And some people find when they go into the first jhana, there's almost like a hot flash, this wave of heat that comes over them. Everything I've read about norepinephrine is like, yep, that's what PT is all about. So I have a page on my website called A Tentative Hypothesis of the Neurological Correlates of the Jhanas. You know a hypothesis is a tentative guess, right? So this is a tentative guess. So I'm thinking PT is dopamine breaking down into norepinephrine. Sukha, the joy, happiness, that's probably opioids. Opioids make you feel good, right? They have more of a calming effect, and as we'll see as we progress through the jhanas, the PT dies out, there's just the sukha left. In other words, the norepinephrine, the muscle stuff calms down, and there's just the emotional stuff left. We could test this. There's a drug that they can give to someone who's had a heroin overdose, and if you give it to them, they pop right out of it because it binds to the receptors better than the heroin does. So if I'm generating opioids, the hypothesis is that they put me in an fMRI, I signal them that I'm in the second jhana. Of course, when I signal, I'm out of the second jhana, but I go back in, it's like, give me a minute or two after that to get back in, right? And then at some point, unknown to me, in this vein they have in my arm, they dump this drug in there and I crash out of the second jhana. We've not done that yet, but it's a possibility. So the first jhana is generating norepinephrine and sukha, norepinephrine and opioids, which we experience as PT and sukha. The second jhana, talking about it, it says, with the subsiding of the background thinking, which is still there in that first jhana, and by gaining inner tranquility and unification of mind, one enters the second jhana, which contains no thinking and PT and sukha born of concentration. Basically, the move to the second jhana is a calming down of the frenetic experience of the first jhana. The thinking quiets down, the mind becomes tranquil, inner tranquility, and unification of mind. The mind coalesces around focusing on not the PT, which is quieted down, but the sukha. The trick for moving from first to second jhana is take a deep breath. Remember I said if you take a deep breath when the breathing gets very shallow, it takes you away from the jhana because it quiets the PT. Now, if you want to quiet the PT, take a deep breath. You take the deep breath. This seems to calm the production of dopamine, breaking it down into norepinephrine, leaving you with just primarily opioids. It doesn't go away completely. The second jhana, you've got the sukha in the foreground and the PT in the background, which is the opposite of what it was in the first jhana. And this is a calmer state, and because it's calmer and you're more concentrated due to having been in the first jhana, the mind can really coalesce around the experience of the sukha. This is now your object of meditation. You're just focused on being happy. Happy like it's your birthday. And somebody gives you a nice present, you open it up and it's, oh, I always wanted one of these, oh, this is so, that kind of happy. Only it's not generated by anything external. It's arising simply from your concentrated mind. But it's the same sort of happiness. There's a simile given in the suttas for this second jhana of a spring-fed lake. And this is exactly what it feels like. It's a happiness-fed yogi. And there's this spring, most people say in the heart center or something like that, where, this just happiness is just welling up, just like it was a spring. You want to learn to maintain this for 10 to 15 minutes by just staying focused on the sense of happiness. The objects are getting more subtle as the numbers go up. The experience, though, is seeming to go down. The first jhana seems to be centered around the head, the second maybe around the heart, And as we go up in number, the physical experience is down. The physical experience of things quieting down, dropping down physically, is so strong that if a student says to me, well, I was in the second jhana and I went up, I don't know if they meant up to 1 or up to 3, up physically, up numerically to 1, or up numerically to 3, or up physically to 1. It's so pronounced that in one of the fMRI runs, they were going to signal me with, earpiece and say, go up to the next jhana. And I said, no, you can't say up or down. I'll just go the wrong way. So they had to say next or previous to tell me what to do. So the move to the third jhana is the piti goes away. The sutta says, with the fading away of rapture, one enters into this third jhana, which has sukha, free from rapture, or happiness free from rapture. So you're in a state that's more like a contented state, a wishless state. The happiness, what a great present happiness is now calmed down to contentment or wishlessness or satisfaction. Satisfaction so deep that if Mick Jagger had been practicing the third jhana, he couldn't sing that song. Right? You're just completely satisfied. It's also very still. In the second jhana, the remnants of the piti may cause some rocking or some swaying or some minor movements. But in the third jhana, it's totally still. And you're just contented. You're wishless. And you hang out in that state for a while. 10 to 15 minutes is what you want to learn to maintain. That state is still pleasant. When you're contented, that's nice. That's a pleasant state of mind. The fourth jhana is a state beyond pleasure and pain. It's a state of emotional neutrality. Now, this doesn't mean there was pain in any of the jhanas, but there's pleasure all the way through the first 3. And so the idea is to drop down to a state beyond pleasure. So an emotionally neutral state. What I find is I can get in touch with that little Buddha smile I have on my face in the third jhana due to the contentment. Just relax all the muscles in my face, and there's a sense of things starting to drop down. I just go with that sense of dropping down and just let it drop down all the way. It feels like going down a well, all the way down to the bottom where there's a place of quiet stillness. And I'm focused on the emotional or the mental state of quiet stillness. It says that the fourth jhana contains mindfulness fully purified by equanimity. Mindfulness in the sense that now your concentration is quite supreme. Your usual way of looking at the world isn't there, and it's fully purified by equanimity. You're in an equanimous state. There's no pleasure, no pain. With the wishlessness of the third jhana, you're just content with it being no pleasure, no pain in this neutral state. What we seem to be doing from a neurological perspective is we excite the nucleus accumbens enough till it goes into this feedback loop. The feedback loop generates the dopamine, which breaks into norepinephrine, brings up the opioids. Now we got to clear out the dopamine. We drop down to the second one. It calms down. We drop to the third, and now the dopamine's gone. We just got the opioids left. Now to drop to the fourth, let's clear out the opioids. And you're down in this place of quiet stillness. And as it says, one has this mindfulness fully purified by equanimity. And so you sit there in this state. Again, you want to be there for 10 to 15 minutes. So why bother? It's a lot of work. Well, the suttas say, after you come out of the fourth jhana, you have a mind that's concentrated, clear, sharp, bright, malleable, wieldy, and given to imperturbability, which you can direct and incline to knowing and seeing. One can understand thus, this is my body, having material form, composed of the 4 great elements, born of mother and father, fed on rice and gruel, impermanent, subject to rubbing and pressing, to dissolution and dispersion. And this is my consciousness, supported by it and bound up with it. The purpose of the jhanas is to create a mind that is concentrated, clear, sharp, bright, malleable, wieldy, and given to imperturbability, which is the perfect kind of mind to have to investigate reality. The Buddha talked frequently about knowing and seeing things as they really are. That's the way it's usually translated. I would prefer to translate it a little bit more loosely as knowing and seeing what's actually happening, because the world is much more verb than noun. Okay, things aren't are, things are happening. Okay, but with this supremely concentrated mind, you have a much better chance of seeing what's going on. We normally look at the world through ego-colored glasses, right? We're basically looking, can I eat that or will that eat me? I mean, we're a little more sophisticated than that, but it's basically, is this something I want to get hold of, or is this something I ought to get rid of? And it's all about me. I'm going to get it, I'm going to get rid of it. Although it looks like it, you might have guessed by now the world does not revolve around me. Okay? By getting to the fourth jhana, you have shut down the parts of your brain that are involved in constructing an ego, a self. Right? We've seen this with other forms of meditation as well as with the jhanas, but the jhanas do a supremely good job of that. You can't be in the jhanas and thinking, oh, I'm a really great person, I'm in the jhanas, because you'll just fall right out. Okay? So you're just so completely focused on this, and you've just spent some amount of time moving into these deep states. When you come out of it and begin investigating the world with what I refer to as an insight practice, you're able to see it from a much less egocentric perspective. In the Tibetan tradition, the bodhisattva of wisdom, the archetype of wisdom, is Manjushri. And he's usually depicted with a sword that he uses to cut the bonds of ignorance. Jhana practice is just sharpening Manjushri's sword. Right? You haven't cut any bonds of ignorance yet. It's a warm-up exercise. You still got to go out and wield the sword. You still have to investigate reality and see what's actually happening. And you don't want to make the mistake of just sharpening. Right? If you just do jhanas, if you just sharpen your sword, eventually you got no sword left. Didn't cut any bonds of ignorance, right? So the idea is to get your mind sharp and then go out and see what's really going on. So these are the four jhanas. It seems very clear from numerous places in the suttas that what the Buddha was suggesting was go practice your jhanas, and then once you've gotten to the fourth, come out and investigate your mind and body. There's the famous Satipatthana Sutta in the Theravadan tradition, which gives 13 different insight practices, 13 ways to investigate the world, at least in the Theravadan version of it. Those 13 practices are, well, the first establishment of mindfulness is mindfulness of the body, right? Body, 6 practices. And then there's mindfulness of Vedana. Vedana means your initial reaction to a sensory input. 3 choices: pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Okay, so pay attention to how your mind is reacting to the sense stimuli you get. Are you categorizing it as pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? We don't pay attention to that, but that's what's running our lives. It's almost like we arrived here on the planet, they gave us an instruction manual, we opened it up, it says seek pleasure, avoid pain, live forever. Okay, and that's what we do. We're just running after sources of pleasant Vedana and running away from sources of unpleasant Vedana. The Buddha said, investigate this. I mean, when I was a hippie, it was, if it feels good, do it, right? Turned out not to be the best advice. The Buddha takes it even further. Really check out what's going on. Third establishment of mindfulness, mindfulness of mind states. Yeah, that's investigating the mind, right? Fourth establishment of mindfulness, investigation of phenomena as phenomena relate to the teachings of the Buddha. It's going to take your mind to do that. So basically the Buddha is saying, use this as a warm-up exercise, and then do some of these other practices to investigate reality. So that's the 4 jhanas. In the suttas, there are also 4 immaterial states. And you sometimes find the 4 jhanas followed by the 4 immaterial states, giving you 8 altered states of consciousness in a sequence. They're not called jhanas in the suttas, but by the time of the Abhidhamma, so we're talking 200 years after the Buddha's death, there were 8 jhanas. There were the rupa jhanas, the material jhanas, and the arupa jhanas, the immaterial jhanas. The first 4, the ones I just described, aren't material. They're obviously mental states, but they were given that name, one in contrast to the arupa that was already there for these other states, but also because in the material world, we've all experienced rapture, happiness, contentment, quiet stillness. But these immaterial states are very different. The first of them goes by the name of the realm of infinite space. Now, infinite is the translator's way of translating that word. At the time of the Buddha, they didn't have the concept of zero. I doubt they had the concept of infinite. So maybe the realm of limitless space or boundless space. The way to get to that place is get some good concentration. So happens that the 4th jhana is a way to get really good concentration. So having been concentrated in the 4th jhana, what my teacher told me as a method for entering the 5th was get in touch with the boundaries of my being. So come out of the 4th jhana. So I'm now in an in-between state. I'm very concentrated, but I'm not in a jhana. Get in touch with the boundaries of my being and expand them to fill the room, and then the building, and then the campus, and then all of Charlottesville, and then out to the horizon, and just keep going. Stay with that expansion. When she told me that, well, Ayya Khema was a very German person. If you had a problem with authority figures, she was probably not going to be a good teacher for you. And so when she told me that, it was, yes, ma'am, I'll go try that and see what happens. My attitude was, oh no, she's gone New Age on me. But I'm going to do the best I can, so when I go back and tell her nothing happened, I really did do a good job. So I get to the 4th jhana, and I get the boundaries of my being, and I start expanding. And after not too long, this vast empty space appears in front of me. It was like I'd walked up to the edge of the Grand Canyon, and I looked over, only there was no bottom and there was no other side. It was just this huge space. It was my birthday. I went up to her afterwards and I said, wow, that was about the best birthday present I ever had. I didn't say to her, I never saw anything this good on acid, but it was true. It was just like, whoa, this was amazing, and it was stable. As long as I kept focused on the spaciousness, it was there. After about 5 minutes, my mind wandered and it was gone, But I was able to repeat it. The 5th jhana is the realm of infinite space. Now, there are people who want to make these realms correspond to ontologically existent realms. Okay, so up there in one of the heavens, you have the heaven of infinite space. And when you're in this jhana, you have actually entered that realm. I'm sorry, I have a background in science and math, and I'm going to say that when you enter the realm of infinite space, you have put your brain into a state that you interpret as experiencing an infinite space. That's our perception of what's going on. But I don't think I actually left the room. All right, so I was still there. But the experience was very, very real, that I had tapped into this, 3D infinite space. It was great to go practice that on top of a mountain. I'd look at the view and close my eyes, step through the jhanas, get ready to go into the 5th, right? Remember the view, put my attention at the edge of the view, keep pressing, and boom, there it was. It was a very easy access, being in a space like that. And it was quite vivid. The 6th jhana is the realm of infinite consciousness. The trick here is to realize that you can't be conscious of an infinite space with a limited consciousness. Your consciousness has to be as big as whatever it's conscious of. So can you turn your attention from the space to your consciousness of the space? Can you become aware of your awareness? If you do that, there's a sense of becoming absorbed into the space, and then your mind is as big as the space was. People whose spiritual tradition was some sort of union with Atman, if they hit this state, they've done it, right? I mean, if you've got an infinite consciousness, you must have had union with all the consciousness in the world. And, well, no, you're having the experience that you interpret as having an infinite consciousness, a limitless consciousness. The seventh jhana is the realm of no-thingness, nothingness. The move is to, okay, you've got this infinite space, this infinite consciousness. What is it conscious of? The sense of space is long gone. Put your attention on the object, and you go, there's no object. There you go, right there, that sense of nothing. When I make the move, I got a beach ball size nothing, right? And I look at the edge, and it's nothing over here, nothing over there, nothing over here, nothing over there. Sort of like you go down into the basement, you hit the light switch, and it doesn't work, and you're trying to see what's down there, and there's nothing right in front of you. And there's nothing over here, and there's nothing over there, and why, there's nothing down here at all. This is the feeling of the seventh jhana. People who stumble into this state unintentionally, and people do stumble into all of these states unintentionally, if they stumble into this one, it's usually pretty freaky. They feel like they've fallen into the void. I've had a number of people come on retreat with me, and they come to their first interview, and they're like, can I tell you something happened to me? And they describe what sounds like the seventh jhana. And I say, well, it sounds like the seventh jhana. And they go, oh, it was really scary. And I ask them what happened, and they talk to the teacher. And the teacher told them to eat something, take a shower, or don't meditate, whatever. So eventually, maybe over the course of a couple of retreats, they get up to the sixth jhana and say, okay, here are the instructions for 7. I don't know if I want to go back there. No, be fine. Give them the instructions, they go away. 3 days later, they come back to the next interview. Yeah. That's right where I was, only this time it wasn't scary. Well, yeah, what they were afraid of was the unknown. They were experiencing something and they didn't know what it was, and it freaked them out. Now that they know what it is, well, there's nothing to be afraid of. It's a great place to hang out. There's nothing to bother you. And then the 8th jhana. The name of it is the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. The word perception is a translation of the Pali word sanya. Sanya is the ability to name things or identify things. So you look up here, you see water bottle, right? Well, you just conceptualize the colored shapes that were appearing in your visual cortex as a water bottle. And you see a person, you see a blackboard, you see a clock, right? But actually, all you're seeing is colored shapes. You take the colored shapes, you look them up in your database of potential objects, and you find something, oh yeah, it looks like a clock, so you call it a clock. This is what is meant by perception. So it's identifying or naming things. So the 8th jhana is the realm of neither identifying nor not identifying, neither naming or not naming. I don't guess that helps a lot. The problem is, it's a state that has no characteristics by which you can describe it. Except you can recognize that you're in a state that has no characteristics by which you can describe it, and if you pay attention, you'll stay there. It's very subtle. All of these states, there's the object, say the contentment of the third, and your one-pointed focus. And you might wobble a bit, right? You drift off into a thought, and the contentment doesn't immediately disappear. You drift off into a thought, it starts to go away. You've come out, but whoops, you're back there, right? And so you reestablish it. You can even do that in 7, right? Don't be gone long. In 8, you might have time for one simple sentence that doesn't contain the words me, my, or I, right? It's really fragile. I couldn't tell you the number of times I'm there, I'm solidly in the 8th jhana, and then the next thing I know, I'm in the middle of some paragraph of distraction. There's no trace of the 8th jhana left. It's a very subtle state. So now the 4 jhanas, by the time of the Abhidhamma, have become the 8 jhanas. And they're described differently. The suttas are very clear that the first jhana does not have one-pointedness as part of it. It has background thinking. The words vitakka and vichara are part of the description of the first jhana, and they specifically mean that there's some thinking going on. By the time of the Abhidhamma, they've taken the meanings of those words, and this is 200 years later, and vitakka and vichara mean initial and sustained attention to the meditation object. Never meant that to the Buddha. And they've thrown in one-pointedness in the first jhana, which can't be there if you've got thinking and more thinking in the background with the vitakka and vichara that the Buddha understood. So you can see the jhanas are getting deeper. Just at the first level, it's now becoming a state of absorption. 800 to 900 years after the Buddha's death, we have the Visuddhimagga, which is a textbook for Orthodox Theravadan Buddhism today. People tend to look to more contemporary literature. I mean, how many of you are reading Galileo? Oh, you might read something by Feynman, perhaps. Okay, so we don't read the old stuff. You know, the new stuff's better. Well, no, sometimes the new stuff just simply doesn't understand what the old stuff was talking about. By the time of the Visuddhimagga, the jhanas had changed to such an extent that it literally says in there that of people who come to meditation, only 1 in a million people can get to the first jhana. Now you look at the suttas and everybody's doing jhana. All these disciples are practicing jhana. Lay people are practicing jhana. The Visuddhimagga jhanas are taught today. There's a monk named the Venerable Pawok, who's a jhana master from southern Burma, and I've studied with him, and he teaches straight from the Visuddhimagga. If you want to study with him and learn the Visuddhimagga jhanas, you should plan on going on retreat for a minimum of 6 months. And then you might have a 30% chance of getting to his first jhana. 30% comes from the monks and nuns at his monastery, people that are doing this full-time for their life. And only 30% of the monks and nuns there can get to that first jhana. This is so different from the picture of what's described in the suttas. And the states that he describes are complete absorption, where you're completely unaware of your body, of any sounds, of the passage of time. Furthermore, you need to experience a nimitta, a circle of light. Again, the circle of light comes from the disinhibiting of the neurons in your visual cortex. If you get quiet enough, the random firings become proportional to the neurons, and in the center of the visual cortex, there's a circle of densely packed neurons, and you start seeing that. This is the same phenomena that produces the tunnel that people who have near-death experience talk about. Right? Their brains are getting quiet, including the visual cortex, and this nimitta appears, and it can sometimes appear as a tunnel. More likely to be a tunnel the quieter your brain. If you're dying, your brain's going to get really quiet. Right? So by the time of the Visuddhimagga, they had 8 different states that they were talking about compared to the 8 states that are found in the suttas. Now, you talk to anyone who's a fan of the Visuddhimagga, and they'll tell you very clearly that, oh no, it's the same states. But if you read the suttas and you read the Visuddhimagga, it's quite clear they're talking about very different states. The suttas, for example, say that for each of the jhanas, you have body awareness. One drenches deep, saturates and suffuses one's body with the rapture and happiness born of concentration, so there is no part of one's body not suffused with rapture and happiness, or piti and sukha. To do that, you've got to have body awareness, and you've got to be aware of, okay, I need to do this, and this is how I do it. Whereas in the Visuddhimagga jhanas, you're gone. So, these are the 8 jhanas. I'll look at them primarily from the sutta perspective. From the sutta perspective, because this is accessible. Which are the real jhanas? Well, that's the wrong question. Which are the jhanas that you can do to generate a mind that's going to help you investigate reality more effectively? The Buddha was maybe the most practical person that ever lived. So what really matters is, what of the states I've described can you learn to have access to and use them so that your investigation of reality yields, well, life-changing results. What I teach on a 10-day course is probably not the same level as the Buddha and his monks were practicing. I would seriously doubt it. But not that different. Perhaps the same states at a much lower level of concentration, but at a level where people actually do find that the insights they gain in the post-jhanic state of mind are life-changing in a positive direction. So it seems like a worthwhile endeavor. Any questions?
I just wanted to ask if you could just write a few key terms on the blackboard for those of us that aren't familiar with the Pali Canon, so that we'll recognize them when we see them.
Okay. All right, so jhana. PT. That's the physical component. Sukha. And that's the emotional component. What other Pali terms did I use?
Only a few.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you know, when you're steeped in the field, you don't even recognize you're using them.
The Theravada work.
Oh, the Visuddhimagga. Okay, so there's the Pali Canon. And I'll put 400 BCE to 25 BCE. It was an oral tradition during this period, and then it was written down. The Visuddhimagga. You know, I'm a computer programmer. I know how to spell if, do, while, go to. I usually just write VSM. VISUDHIMAGGA. Okay, this is 5th century CE.
My question is not relevant to this, but you mentioned that you did scientific research in Wisconsin University?
No, in University of Washington in Seattle.
So I'm just wondering, did they, when they took a picture, whatever, of your brain wave, did they have another group? For example, you know, you were doing the dhyana or jhana practice, and another person is like me, thinking of the ice cream, the chocolate, and of course there will be, you know, joyful feeling come up from my mind. So I'm just wondering whether the brain wave will be very similar, you know.
Right. Yeah. They have pictures of my brain at rest, where I'm supposed to be just lying there, not meditating. I mean, when you're laying in something like that, the obvious thing is, oh, just meditate. So I'm just there, and so I would be thinking of something. I don't remember whether it was ice cream. I think I was thinking about a computer problem, okay? So there was definite mental activity. So they got that as a baseline for me just sitting there, not meditating, but actually, you know, working on something. Then I had a little timer clicker. And so I would click twice to say, okay, I'm moving to whatever comes next, right? Which was starting to meditate. So 2 clicks. And then once the meditation kicked in, 1 click, I'm there. And then the next 2 clicks meant I was at access concentration. I was going to move to access concentration. I guess I did 2 clicks, and then when I got to access, so it was a long time, 5-10 minutes, and I clicked once, I'm at access. I hung out there for a while. 2 clicks, I'm going to go to the first jhana. 1 click, I arrived. Okay, so now when I do the one click, I've arrived. I just left it when I did the one click, so I now have to reestablish. So I said, throw away the first 20 seconds after each click. It'll take me that long to really get established again. And then the same thing as I move through. So we had runs of me at rest, meditating, but not at access, first, second, all the way up. So then we could compare. And on my website, there's actually a picture of my brain on jhanas. And you can see the difference between rest and second jhana. And there are some parts of the brain, quite a number, that are in blue. Those got quieter. Some parts of the brain in red or yellow, and those got more active. And some parts of the brain that, it didn't really change. More of it turned blue than red. I was pleased. The places that turned red were the nucleus accumbens area, also the left prefrontal cortex, which is associated with positive emotional states, like rapture, happiness, contentment, and even equanimity. In the fourth jhana, even though it's subjectively neutral, it shows much more activity in the left prefrontal cortex than the right prefrontal cortex. So we have me to compare with me. But the major problem is, these were research guys sneaking me in as part of their budget, right? We didn't have a lot of money to do a lot of people. So, it was kind of, well, let's see if we get anything. At Yale, they did have some money, but again, it was part of other projects. So there was a little more. There's me, there's one of my students who's better at the jhanas than I am. And there's somebody who practices the Visuddhimagga jhanas. And so we've got their data. And this is going to be really interesting to look at. Last October, they told me they would have the analysis of the data soon. I think soon means within a year or two, because we still don't have it. I'm seeing the researcher next week, and I'll ask him. Yeah.
Can you talk about the jhanas in relation to shamatha?
Yeah. Shamatha means calm. So this is calm. Samadhi means focus calm. Jhanas are a high form of samadhi. Okay, so shamatha would be a large range of practices. And then samadhi would be the ones that would produce one-pointed concentration. And then the jhanas would be specific one-pointed concentration.
They talk about the 10 stages of shamatha in the Tibetan literature, and it talks
Right.
about when you reach the 10th stage of the realization of luminosity and bliss and non-conceptuality. And they talk about how mental and physical pliancy is achieved. And I've heard it many times that it's hypothesized that there's a major reorganization of the entire nervous system that takes place at the time of the realization of shamatha. And I wondered what you thought about that, or if that's been demonstrated at all neurologically.
Yeah, I don't know about any demonstrations. My reading of the various stages of shamatha, what I call access concentration seems to correspond to number 4. What the Visuddhimagga calls access concentration seems to correspond to number 10. The Tibetan literature mentions the jhanas a number of places. I found it in 3 or 4 different writings, so it's in there, only as something to study, not to practice, unfortunately. But their description certainly matches much more closely to what's described in the Visuddhimagga than what's described in the early suttas. Now, I'm not saying the Tibetans got it from the Visuddhimagga. In fact, I would be highly suspicious of anyone who said that. I suspect they got it from a common source. In other words, as the jhanas became increasingly strong over the years, at some point it forked. That understanding went to Sri Lanka, where the Visuddhimagga was written, and that same understanding went to Tibet, where the Tibetan literature that we have has an understanding. So 4 would be the access concentration I talked about, 10 would be the Visuddhimagga access concentration.
Do you relate the jhana system in any way to the Kundalini system of thought?
As far as I know, Kundalini, Piti, and Tummo, the Tibetan mystic heat practice, all are using the same energies. This is the best that I've been able to come up with. I haven't practiced Kundalini officially, but talking to students that have practiced Kundalini yoga, they say, oh yeah, we do that all the time. They just use the energy differently. Then talking to two people that had worked with Tummo, it seemed like it was the same energy. As I mentioned, sometimes PT comes on as heat, and so the Tummo practice would be learning to make the PT manifest as heat. When it comes on for me, mostly it's vibration, right, which not going to really keep you that warm, right? The Tummo heat practice seems to be able to generate the PT as heat. So I think they're the same neurological thing, it's just used differently.
So you mentioned you have a student who you said is better at the jhanas than you. Could you elaborate on that and how one might compare one versus the other?
Well, one thing, he lives at home, which I don't do, right? So he's got a nice stable environment, and he meditates for 2 hours and 5 minutes every morning. Okay, he wants a 2-hour meditation. He wants 5 minutes to get himself settled and so forth. So he's got a really good daily practice. And he's quite skilled at this. He picked the stuff up really quickly. So he's got a natural skill and a great daily practice. And so he's just very good at getting his mind really calmed down into access, knows these states, moves through them, does some insight practice. Since my life is somewhat chaotic, living on the road all the time, my daily practice is, well, questionable whether the word daily applies. So I'm not as good at it as I used to be. When I go on retreat, it gets better because, repeated days of having good practice, then it starts to come back. It's like riding a bicycle or something. So it's a skill, and it's almost mechanical. You can learn to do this, and you can crank out a concentrated mind. If only we could do this for insights, just do something and crank out the insights.
That leads to my question. When you talked about the first 4 jhanas, you talked about time and how much time you should spend cultivating.
Right.
And then when you got beyond 4, you didn't talk about time.
10 to 15 minutes, again. Okay.
So among the 8, you go as far, you work your way, and then you go as far as you can stay, and you stay as long as you can stay, and at some point, then you can range among the 8. That's my question.
Okay, so I tell the students to get good enough at a jhana so they can maintain it for 10 to 15 minutes before learning the next one, okay? But as you're moving through them, say you know all 8. I could move through all 8, not in a really deep way. There was a 45-minute meditation period. I could move through all 8 in about 20 to 25 minutes, okay? Wasn't as good if it was an hour-and-a-half meditation period and I was taking like 40 minutes to move through all of them, or an hour to move through all of them. So basically the idea is to move through them based on the length of time that you're going to be meditating. And I would tell students that, once you've got them down, then spend a length of time in one of the jhanas besides the last one each time. So if you know all 8 jhanas, first time, stay in the second jhana for 10 minutes. The next time you go through, maybe you're only a couple minutes in 2, but in 4 you stay 10 minutes. So that each of them gets a lengthy time while you're playing with it. But it's going to depend on a lot. Number one being how long is this meditation period going to be before the bell rings? And so the general rule of thumb is use about half the time for concentration, about half the time for insight. But don't look at your watch.
I'm interested in the concept of altered consciousness itself.
Mm-hmm.
The implication is that what we call ordinary consciousness, what we're all
Right.
probably indulging in right now, is ordinary, natural. These altered states of consciousness, the records of human endeavors are full of the drive to experience non-ordinary consciousness or unordinary consciousness. What role do these altered states play? We seem, as a species, to be drawn to it. We seem as a species to seek it out by way of chemical or practice or whatever method we might select to investigate this. Are we to suppose that this is a portal through which the human species passed along with the Buddha for the first time? Or is this an innate, inborn desire and ability that we have perhaps lost as we've accommodated the rigors of society?
It's a great question, and I really, really wish I had the answer. I don't know. I mean, these states weren't invented, they were discovered.
Exactly.
People would come to me and they'd say, can I tell you about something that happened? And almost inevitably, they're going to describe one of these 8 states. The mind likes to go into these states. I think of them, if you're familiar with chaos theory, as strange attractors. You get a pattern in your brain that looks something like this. If you just be quiet, it's going to go into this state. So you get quiet and you get some idea of nothing, and your mind will go into the state of the realm of nothingness. So we do seem to have that in there. The fascination, I could speculate, but it would just be speculation. One would be that, okay, so human beings found themselves embedded in a world where there were forces that they couldn't control, right? They couldn't make the rain come, they couldn't stop the lions from eating people, things like this. So they're looking for external help, right? So they invent a god, pray to the god, make the god happy, he sends the rains, keeps the lions away, right? Sometimes, just sitting here and praying to him is not good enough. What if we go visit him, face-to-face conversation? And so people figured out ways to put themselves in trances so that he'd go talk to God face-to-face. So that's a hypothesis. They had somehow discovered that eating this mushroom or just sitting there quietly staring off into the sunset opened up these portals, as you call them, these access to these states. And so they attempted to use them in various ways. The Buddha actually had 2 teachers before he set out on his own. And the first of those teachers taught him the 7th jhana. We assume taught him all the 6 before that, but we don't know. It just says his teaching culminated in the 7th jhana. But the Buddha left, or the Buddha-to-be left, because the teacher was saying, that's the end of the path. When you're there, you're done. He's going, no man, when I come out, there's still all the craziness out here. So he goes to another teacher who teaches him the 8th jhana, says that's the end of the path. And he's like, no man, still all the craziness when I come out. So he was wise enough to recognize that this was not the end of the path, and then later to realize, yeah, but they might be useful on the path. And so he went back to doing jhana practice, and apparently was doing that the night he woke up. So, the question you ask raises so many very interesting things from philosophy and neuroscience and ancient cultures and everything else. And I'm afraid all I can do is speculate. Yeah.
Speaking of speculation, I've speculated on the possibility that just as Piaget outlined developmental stages in childhood development, my suspicion and speculation is that these altered states of consciousness that you describe, and that we work so diligently and hard to achieve in early, perhaps pre-reason levels of childhood development, are natural, normal states where we virtually live all the time for periods.
Right.
Perhaps the first jhana, in the first year of life, and we move to the second jhana, something akin to that. And that what we are actually trying to do in these adult endeavors is to revisit the bliss of our infancy.
Perhaps. It's certainly true that people experience these as a kid. Off the top of my head, I'd say about 20% of students report having done 1 or more jhanas as a kid. I remember one student, she had the first 4 jhanas down. And she'd be doing that, and her mom would say, quit goofing off, go out and play. And when she, finally recovered them, she was so happy. But the Buddha wasn't about the bliss. He did say, these are a pleasure I will allow myself. But the main thing seemed to be, this is a warm-up exercise for investigating reality. So.
But that's the real bliss. I mean, the bliss kind of a path of bliss and little bliss. You know, the bliss I'm talking about is really the blissfulness of
Yeah, of waking up.
omniscience in a sense. I mean, would that not be blissful?
Yeah, I would suspect so. At least enough omniscience, if it wasn't omni, so you would stop making the stupid mistakes.
I don't really know how to ask this question, but you know, you've sort of given some instructions for going in, and you've said, okay, now you've sharpened your sword, and now it's time to go out. And how much do you think this organic experience of the capacities and awakenings that have happened is going to show us about how to go out and investigate reality, not just our own, but
Yeah.
the way it's playing out, and make a difference?
Yeah, I was very happy the Buddha left a lot of instructions about how to investigate reality.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a lot of different practices that are found in the suttas, as well as a huge number more that have been invented over the years since then. The actual coming out is just simply changed from focusing on the object of the jhana to starting to do the practice, and the feeling of the jhana just fades out. So, yeah, I appreciate the instructions I've been given. I've played with inventing my own. I've come up with some that I found helpful. But yeah, they were all sort of based on stuff I'd learned from somewhere else and just modify.
So I'm just wondering, when we kind of take some of the practices out of the context of the teaching about how to apply it, what new challenges does that ask of us if we're not going to use those instructions precisely, or we're in a different time when they don't necessarily fully answer our needs?
Yeah, with a mind that has mindfulness fully purified by equanimity, whatever you put it to, it's one, going to be less ego stuff involved in it, which is going to give you a better sense of reality, whether it be an ancient practice, a spiritual practice, or fixing a bug in a computer program. All right? So, yes, this can be used to enhance other things. I guess I've never been tempted to do other things with it because, well, I got into meditation out of curiosity in the first place. I wanted to know what's going on. And that's been the driving force for, what, almost 30 years now. What's really going on? And so, yeah, I'll just use the smarts I've got to fix the computer program bug. When I've got this kind of mind, I want to investigate reality rather than fix some mundane bug. So I haven't done much else with it. I mean, sometimes I go for a walk after being in the jhanas, and I can enjoy nature a lot more. I remember stepping outside of the meditation hall when I was first learning the upper jhanas and looking at the pansies and going, wow, I didn't know they made those colors, because it was just so vivid. And so going for a walk post-jhana, yeah, it's a pretty nice experience. Does that?
I'm not sure, but go ahead. Other questions?
Well, I was just going to say we're probably kind of getting to
Oh,
the end.
we are.
Maybe I could just ask you one last question, and people could follow up after the talk, which is, it's been a long, long history in Buddhism of controversies over the nature of concentration, the
Right.
value of concentration, its limits, and how to present it, what the consequences are. And so if we just look in this area that you're positioned within the 21st century, we had a brief discussion this weekend about the spectrum of contemporary figures' approaches that have been influential in Europe and America. All the way from, in Burma, jhanas are kind of looked at negatively for the most part. The people who practice them are a few anomalous figures, as you mentioned, and then these wezas, these wizards that evidently practice it, and not entirely clear what else they do. And then you have these very hardcore, on the other spectrum, this very hardcore approach that takes months and months, and a small percentage of people get access to them and so forth. So I was just wondering if you could tell us, like, from your experience, those people, those very famous teachers in Burma who come to the US and very influential people that you're involved with as well, the ones who tend to discourage the practice of the jhanas, whether you see them as reacting to these more hardcore perspectives, or whether they develop concentration in their practitioners from other practices, such as we discussed, chanting, music, even scriptural recitation and so forth, or just how does concentration happen for those figures, and How do we
Right.
understand their animosity?
Yeah. Well, as I said, Theravadan Buddhism is principally Visuddhimagga Buddhism. So they're looking at the really, really difficult, the 1 in a million jhanas, and going, these hippies coming from America? They can't do that, right? I mean, most of our monks can't do that. Let's give them what we've given the ordinary people. So generally that was what was brought back, and that's what teachers in the West are primarily working with, was the practices that developed almost in place of the jhanas in Asia, because almost nobody could do the jhanas as they were understood in Asia. So Mahasi Sayadaw, who's one of the famous Burmese masters from the early 20th century, when he became abbot, he was like, well, nobody meditates. That's because nobody knows how to meditate except, well, we can read it in the book, but we can't do that. So he went to northern Burma, got some practices, brought them back to Rangoon for his monks. And that became Orthodox Burmese Theravadan Buddhism. And that's what got it imported back to the US. So it's generally felt in the Orthodox Western Vipassana scene that, yeah, you don't even need to get to access concentration. Momentary concentration is enough, okay? And so you're sitting there and something gets your attention, as long as you're not lost in Bermuda, right? And you're just, yeah, okay, somebody made a sound, or I have an itch on my nose, or whatever, and your mind just sort of looking around, seeing what's going on. That's good enough. And that seems to be where it's gone until you become an advanced student. And then they might teach you the Brahma Vihara practices, practices of loving friendliness, loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. And so those are thought of in Orthodox Theravadan Buddhism as concentration practices. The Visuddhimagga says there are other ways to get to the jhanas, and indeed they can, whether you're getting to the jhanas I described from the suttas or the ones from the Visuddhimagga or the Abhidhamma, any of those various sets. You can use the Brahma-Vihara practices to get there. So yeah, they generate concentration. That's about all that's talked about in Orthodox Theravadan Buddhism, East or West, in terms of concentration practice. Otherwise, it's just momentary concentration. In other words, you're not lost, but you're not one-pointedly focused. And that's clearly not what the Buddha was talking about.
Well, thank you so much.
No, thank you. If anybody's got more questions, I'm happy.